In the late 1930s, inside the Kharkov locomotive plant, a small cadre of engineers worked under a pressure few outsiders could imagine. Their chief, Mikhail Koshkin, knew the next European war would not be won by ornate parade machines, but by ruthless practicality. A tank that could move fast on bad roads, shrug off enemy fire at medium ranges, and be built in quantities that would overwhelm any tactical setback. Lessons from Spain and Khalkhin Gol were stark. Thin armor burned, gasoline engines ignited like torches, and narrow tracks mired vehicles in spring mud. The answer, Koshkin believed, was a low, sloped hull that deflected shells, a diesel engine less prone to fire, and wide tracks that floated over soil like snowshoes. Designing such a machine under Stalin was a gamble with human lives. Purges had culled the officer corps and touched industry. Failure could mean prison. Yet, in 1940, Koshkin staged a defiant trial by endurance. Two prototypes, a 34s, drove more than 2,000 kilometers through sleet and dust, fording rivers, climbing ridges, rattling into Moscow beneath skeptical eyes, and back again to Kharkov. The route was a statement carved in gear oil. This was not a laboratory toy, but a soldier's tool. The prototypes returned battered but alive. Stalin approved production. Workers laid out jigs and gauges. Foundries learned the angles of sloped armor. A diesel heart, the W2, was matched to a rugged 5-speed gearbox. No one yet knew that this compact silhouette, with its road wheel rhythm and turret like a clenched fist, would become the steel signature of a nation at war. When Operation Barbarossa erupted in June 1941, the Red Army staggered beneath a hurricane of surprise, speed, and ruthlessness. Headquarters fell silent, airfields burned, entire formations dissolved on roads choked with refugees. Into this chaos rolled an unfamiliar profile. At Minsk, then Smolensk, German anti-tank crews watched their rounds shatter or ricochet from an angled glacis that looked too simple to be clever. The new Soviet tank, soon to be christened by its legend as much as its number, carried a 76.2 millimeter gun that could punch through early panzers at combat ranges. Its diesel sounded different, deeper, its tracks, broader than German counterparts, clawed through dust and marsh where others spun helplessly. Yet the T-34's promise met a brutal reality. Crews were often undertrained, radios were scarce, commanders died faster than replacements could learn their craft. Many T-34s fought alone, tossed into crises as fire brigades, their green crews navigating by smoke and instinct. They were knocked out by artillery ambushes, mechanical teething, or sheer isolation. Still, messages filtering back to Berlin carried an unwelcome refrain. Our standard guns are failing. Their armor is sloped. Approach from the flank. Call for 80s. Even in defeat, the tank planted a seed of dread. In the fields around Yelnya and the bends of the Dnieper, wrecks cooled beside wrecks, German and Soviet alike. But for the first time since June, Wehrmacht crews learned that the East would not be conquered with impunity. The T-34 had arrived and the battlefield calculus had changed. If 1941 was catastrophe, 1942 was recalibration at industrial scale. Whole factories, Kharkov, Leningrad, even tool shops the width of schoolrooms, were unbolted, tagged, and heaved onto rail cars bound for the Urals and Siberia. Men shoveled snow from newly poured floors. Women wired looms for turret harnesses. Teenagers learned to grind bearing races to the ghost tolerances of blueprints smeared by the journey. In Nizhny Tagil, Magnitogorsk, and Chelyabinsk. Tankograd. The sirens never slept. Foundry heat billowed against air so cold it turned breath into crystals. The T-34 was redesigned not for luxury, but for throughput. Castings replaced welded subassemblies. Simplified optics accelerated turret completion. Machining time on hull plates was shaved by minutes that became thousands of hours across a year. A knocked-out tank ceased to be tragedy. It became a scheduling input. For every hull lost on the front, 2, then 3 emerged from assembly lines with fewer machining operations and sturdier field fixes. Crews arriving from training schools discovered a stern virtue. The machine forgave rough handling and punished hesitation less than rivals did. If a gearbox protested, a sledgehammer and grease could persuade it. If a road wheel failed, spares were common. If a track pin sheared, a crew's hands and a length of bar could set the tread again. By winter, battalions moved with a new rhythm. Companies rotating to repair parks at night, rejoining at dawn with soot on faces and frost in eyebrows. The Red Army was learning to multiply pressure faster than the Wehrmacht could restore equilibrium. The summer of 1943 gathered iron like thunderheads. Operation Citadel hurled Germany's best, Panthers, Tigers, elite Panzer Grenadiers, into the salient around Kursk, imagining a scythe stroke to restore initiative. Opposite them, Soviet engineers had carved the earth into concentric belts, minefields like iron meadows, anti-tank ditches, camouflaged gun lines, and fallback trenches, where saplings had been woven into living revetments. Beneath tarpaulins and in copses, cut into dummy orchards, T-34s idled, exhaust threading upward like incense. When the attack came, it met mathematics. Density of fire, not glamour, wrote the opening stanza. German spearheads gnawed through Belt 1, then 2. But every kilometer traded blood for time, and time delivered reserves. At Prokhorovka, Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army drove straight into the SS Panzer Corps at ranges where optics meant less than nerve. Crews fired on silhouettes and muzzle flashes, ramming when guns jammed, pivoting around burning hulks that became temporary berms. A T-34 could not frontally duel a Tiger at range. It could outnumber, outflank, and outlast. By dusk, the field resembled a foundry's scrapyard flung to the horizon. The German offensive, tactically dangerous but strategically brittle, stalled under the combined weight of depth, repair, and replacements. For the first time, the Wehrmacht had thrown its armored best into a prepared Soviet defense and lost the initiative it would never recover. The T-34, imperfect yet inexhaustible, had been the hinge on which the day turned. Kursk was not an end, but a pivot. Frontline reports demanded clearer sights, faster turret handling, better high-velocity punch. The answer rolled onto railheads through 1944, the T-34/85. A new 3-man turret freed commanders from loading chores. The 85mm gun reached out where the 76 had struggled, and internal stowage and radios improved the choreography of platoons in motion. Factories integrated the changes without surrendering tempo. Welders learned new seams. Optics assemblers standardized mounts by the tens of thousands. In Poland's fields and the Baltic's pine forests, long columns of T-34/85s moved like black rivers at night, headlamps hooded, engines drumming, crews eating from mess tins atop warm engine decks. Names chalked on turrets. Revenge, for Mama, Stalingrad, were not decoration, but vows. Against Panthers, the 34/85 did not promise invulnerability. It promised presence, enough hulls, enough shells, enough trained crews to turn any German success into a tactical anecdote rather than a strategic recovery. By the time the Red Army crossed the Vistula and lunged for the Oder, the T-34 had become more than a machine. It was a system, rail lines feeding depots, depots feeding brigades, brigades feeding fronts, all synchronized to a cadence the Wehrmacht could not imitate. And when that steel tide reached Berlin's streets, shattered masonry, tram wires hanging like nerves, the tank that began as a risky prototype in Kharkov finished its argument in the Reich's ruined capital. The weapon had matured. The war was tilting to its final verdict. By late 1942, the war's center of gravity shifted to the ruins of Stalingrad. Streets once lined with factories now formed canyons of shattered brick. Among them, the T-34 became both sword and shield. It fought at ranges so close that tank crews could hear the enemy reload. Frozen oil, shattered optics, and lack of fuel turned every engagement into a duel of nerve. Yet the tank's design thrived in this chaos. Its diesel engine coughed to life even in minus 30 degrees Celsius frost. Its armor shrugged off ricochets that killed lighter machines, and its tracks ground over rubble where German half-tracks failed. Inside the factories still clinging to life on the Volga's west bank, workers built tanks under bombardment. Hulls rolled straight from the assembly line into combat. Crews were issued their machines inside the same workshops that forged them. The T-34 became the city's heartbeat. Each gunshot, another pulse of defiance. When the encirclement closed around the German 6th Army, many of the tanks that led the final assault had been welded together within sight of the front. Stalingrad proved that Soviet industry and courage could turn ruin into rebirth. The winter of 1942-43 revealed the T-34's second secret: endurance. While German tanks froze solid or starved of fuel, the diesel engines of Soviet armor purred through nights of blizzards. Mechanics wrapped engines in tarpaulins, lit fires beneath hulls, and kept batteries alive with body heat. When the counteroffensive began, entire armored brigades emerged from snow-covered forests like ghosts. Mobility was everything. The T-34's wide tracks bit into ice and mud that swallowed heavier Panthers whole. Supply trucks couldn't keep up, so tank crews siphoned fuel from wrecks and melted snow for radiator water. Every kilometer east of Kharkov was reclaimed at the cost of dozens of hulls. But for every destroyed machine, another appeared from the Urals. To the Wehrmacht, it seemed as if the Red Army had tapped an endless reservoir of steel. The legend of Soviet inexhaustibility had become fact, and its symbol was painted olive gray with a white turret star. The T-34's power lay not only in engineering, but in the men and women who lived within its iron shell. Crews came from every corner of the USSR: Siberian miners, Ukrainian farmhands, Moscow students. Inside a cramped hull, they learned a rhythm of survival measured in seconds. Loader and gunner moved like reflections. The commander's voice was hoarse from shouting through smoke. Many tanks went to battle with chalked words on the armor: Zarodinu, for the motherland. Training was brutal but brief. 3 weeks could separate a recruit's first lesson from his first engagement. Yet the simplicity of the design saved lives. Controls were intuitive, repairs crude but effective, spare parts interchangeable across hundreds of models. Crews carried welding kits, fuel lines, and a sense of fatalistic humor. They slept under their machines, ate from the engine deck, and fought beside the same comrades until either victory or flame. The T-34 was more than a weapon. It was a shared coffin and a promise that no one would fight alone. In June 1944, the Red Army unleashed Operation Bagration, the most devastating offensive of the war. Hundreds of T-34s spearheaded the assault through forests and marshes of Belarus. Recon units marked crossings. Engineers built pontoon bridges under fire. Tank brigades thundered forward before the smoke cleared. German radio operators described the sound as a continuous metallic roar, a hurricane of steel. The offensive erased Army Group Center from the map. T-34s stormed Vitebsk, Orsha, and Minsk in weeks. German columns, unable to redeploy, were sliced apart by mobile groups that bypassed strong points and struck deep into the rear. Crews drove for 20 hours at a stretch, half asleep, trusting instinct more than orders. Dust coated their uniforms, and the smell of diesel and cordite became the perfume of victory. By the campaign's end, Soviet tanks had advanced 600 kilometers and liberated half of Belarus. The T-34 had become the very definition of momentum. By the last year of the war, the T-34 was no longer merely a machine. It was the embodiment of the Soviet Union's identity. The tank appeared on propaganda posters, in songs, and in soldiers' dreams. Children in evacuated villages shaped toy T-34s from clay. Veterans carved its silhouette into trench walls. To the world, it symbolized resilience, crude yet brilliant, simple yet unstoppable. Technicians kept refining it, new optics, better radio coordination, thicker turret armor. But its essence remained pure function. When foreign correspondents toured the assembly lines of Nizhny Tagil in 1945, they found women still welding by hand, sparks illuminating faces lined by exhaustion and pride. The war was nearly over, but the rhythm of production continued, as if the factories themselves refused to rest until the last shot was fired. The T-34 had transcended its creators. It had become the face of victory itself, the weapon that carried the weight of a nation's survival. As 1945 dawned, the Red Army crossed one natural barrier after another, the Vistula, the Oder, the Danube. Each crossing was a masterpiece of improvisation and sacrifice. Pontoon engineers worked knee-deep in icy water, while German artillery thundered from the opposite bank. When bridges collapsed, T-34s simply plunged through the shallows, engines howling, crews praying the current would not seize their treads. By now, the T-34/85 dominated the front. Its heavier gun matched the Panther. Its reliability surpassed it. Soviet armor moved like living rivers, columns stretching from horizon to horizon. Behind every tank, repair trucks followed with spare tracks and barrels, while field kitchens brewed tea beside piles of shell casings. For German defenders, each new dawn brought the same sound, that metallic heartbeat echoing through the mist. Cities fell in rapid succession: Warsaw, Poznan, Budapest. Each victory cost hundreds of burned-out hulls, but replacements rolled west faster than the Germans could retreat. The T-34 had become an unstoppable current sweeping across the ruins of Europe, April 1945. The sky over the Oder flashed with the fire of thousands of guns. The final offensive had begun. Soviet artillery rumbled without pause for hours, softening the ground for the tanks that waited behind smoke screens. Among them stood the veterans, crews who had survived from Kursk to Königsberg. Their tanks were patched with mismatched plates, their turrets scarred by near misses, yet each bore the same inscription: Na Berlin. When the order came, The T-34 surged forward through minefields and shattered woods. The city loomed like a furnace, its streets choked with rubble, every intersection a trap. German Panzerfaust teams stalked from basements, snipers fired from attics. Every meter of progress demanded blood, but the Red Army had mastered urban warfare. T-34s advanced in pairs with infantry clinging to their hulls, firing point-blank into windows and barricades. The roar of engines drowned out the last speeches in Hitler's bunker. On May 2nd, the guns fell silent. The red flag rose above the Reichstag. Around it stood a forest of exhausted machines, the steel soldiers of the East, their armor blackened, their purpose fulfilled. When peace returned, the T-34 did not rest. It rolled into parades, onto railway flats bound for Asia, the Middle East, and Europe rebuilt under Soviet banners. Factories kept the lines running, exporting thousands of tanks to new allies. From the snows of Korea to the deserts of Sinai, its silhouette appeared again, proof that the design born in Kharkov still lived in the age of jet fighters. Veterans visited memorials and touched the cold steel of preserved turrets, whispering names of fallen comrades. In every Soviet town, a T-34 stood on a plinth, its gun raised not in war, but remembrance. Mechanics who had once patched holes with scrap metal now guided school children through museum halls, telling them how the tank that never gave up saved their country. Even decades later, when newer machines replaced it, no weapon matched its legend. The T-34 had transcended time, not merely a vehicle, but a memory cast in armor. Engineers around the world studied the T-34 long after the war. Western experts marveled at its balance of mobility, protection, and production simplicity. It had rewritten the rule book of armored warfare, a machine built for mass, yet with elegance in its purpose. In its lineage could be traced the DNA of every modern main battle tank: sloped armor, wide tracks, diesel efficiency, crew ergonomics born from survival rather than comfort. But the greater legacy was spiritual. The T-34 symbolized a truth that transcended technology, that resolve, organization, and shared sacrifice could forge victory even from catastrophe. It represented a union of factory workers and frontline soldiers, of design born in fear and perfected in endurance. Long after its steel rusted, its name carried weight not as a number, but as a promise, that even the most desperate nation could find strength in unity and will. When the smoke of Berlin finally cleared, the Red Army counted its losses. 27 million lives, tens of thousands of tanks, a continent in ruins. Yet among that devastation stood the machine that had carried them from the ashes of 1941 to the gates of victory. The T-34 was no miracle. It was the result of human labor measured in tears and molten steel. Every plate was forged by hands that refused to yield. Every weld marked defiance. Every tank lost, bought time for another to reach the front. In its simplicity lay genius, in its endurance, faith. The T-34 had turned the tide of the greatest war in history, not through perfection, but through persistence. As veterans watched it rumble past in post-war parades, they saw not just a machine, but their own reflection, scarred, resilient, immortal. The T-34 was more than a weapon. It was destiny shaped in steel.